Good evening. It's really good to see you all here. My name is Dr. Stanley Amolidis, and I'm the director of the Arthur Maurer Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College, University of Manitoba. I think I may have mentioned to you, or some of you that may have attended other sessions, whenever I introduce myself as Stanley, I chuckle inside because that was the name that was reserved for my mom. She was mad at me, Stanley. So for tonight, I asked you to just call me Stan. Welcome, good evening to the 16th annual MLT Aikins St. Paul's Lecture Series. Now, the purpose of these lecture series is to foster dialogue, collaboration between the students and faculty of the Peace and Conflict Studies graduate programs at University of Manitoba. I would also add to foster dialogue with all of you who are here. And truth be told, Dr. Hinton, I'm really looking forward to this lecture. Before I go on, I would first like to introduce Dr. Christopher Adams, the rector of St. Paul's College and the chair of the Board of Directors for the Maurer Institute of Directors, to bring his greetings.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Christopher Adams. I'm the rector of St. Paul's College, and I just want to say we firstly acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of many First Nations people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation, and we work hard to promote reconciliation, both here at St. Paul's College, within the University of Manitoba, and the broader community. So welcome to the MLT Aikins Lecture. We're so pleased to have our honored guest here tonight. I do want to say that MLT Aikins is, for over 16 years, has been sponsoring this important lecture. We've brought important people from across the world to come and speak in this lecture hall. MLT Aikins is one of the largest law firms within Western Canada, and our board emeritus, Tom Dooley, is a retired member of MLT Aikins. Jonathan Croft, who's had health issues today, he's unable to come and bring greetings from MLT Aikins, but we do acknowledge the long-term support of this important law firm and its continuing to support for us. So thank you very much, and welcome, Dr. Hinton. Who's next, Dan? Thank you.
I'm going to invite Dr. Adam Muller from Peace and Justice Studies here at the University of Manitoba to introduce our speaker. But before I do, share a little bit that, oops, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have touched it. Secrets go! Oh, no. There you go. Adam tells me that he and Alex have a long history. They've known each other for a while. So I just cannot wait to hear some of the juicy details that you're going to share with us tonight. But before we hear Adam announce his relationship with Alex, allow me to announce the game that we are about to enter tonight. Not a hockey game, not a tennis game, not a football game. Instead, I think we are about to enter, experience, listen, inquire, and talk about a language game. And like all games, we want to know what the rules are so that we know what game we're in. And if the players in the game share the same rules. What if they don't have the same rules? What if they have different rules that we don't know about. What might the consequences of that be? I'm a tennis player. When we play doubles, we have signals. We give our partner a signal as to what we're going to do. I'm going to poach. I'm going to stay where I am. I'm going to pull back. They know. But my job is not to let you know what my signal is. So I think this is going to be a fun evening. And I ask you to come with a sense of curiosity, and let's engage in this game of what I call a language game. So, now that I've set the context of what is to come, I'm pleased to invite Dr. Adam Muller to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
I'm a little taller than the average bear. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the Moore Institute's Stan Amalatis and Jason Brennan for doing all of the hard organizational work required to make tonight's MLT Aikins lecture possible. And of course, I'd like to also thank the distinguished MLT Aikins law firm for their continuing sponsorship of this important lectureship, which remains one of the signal events in the Moore Institute's annual calendar. Thanks to everyone concerned. So I was asked to take a couple of minutes today to introduce to you this year's MLT Aikins lecturer and my treasured colleague and friend, Dr. Alexander Hinton. I first met Alex nearly 20 years ago in the context of a research cluster that colleagues and I established with the support of the University of Manitoba's Institute for the Humanities in order to explore the nature and functioning of various kinds of war representations. Alex was introduced to me by my friend and sociology colleague, Andrew Woolford, who I believe came to know of Alex's work via their shared interest in genocide. At a cluster-related workshop dinner during our first meeting here in Winnipeg, I engaged in a truly memorable argument with Alex when he and I disagreed about some of the more rarefied aspects of social constructionism. Words really can't do justice to my delight at finding in Alex someone with great conceptual range, a vast storehouse of relevant examples and experiences, a powerful ability to synthesize and unpack arguments, and a gift for expressive language. I found out later his wife's a poet, an award-winning poet, so that may be part of where this comes from. Above all, I was drawn in by Alex's generosity of spirit, his default tendency to try and make the most of my ideas as well as his own. I'm sure that Alex's remarks here today will exhibit the same astuteness, timeliness, and nuance found in all of his scholarly productions, most especially those parts of his teaching and writing practice devoted to understanding genocidal perpetration. Dr. Alex Hinton is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, as well as Director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University in Newark, where he additionally serves as the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Prevention. Alex's groundbreaking work on Cambodia's genocide and subsequent transitional justice processes remains standard reading in the field, particularly the award-winning Why Did They Kill? Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide from 2004, and 2016's Man or Monster, the trial of a Khmer Rouge torturer. More recently, Alex has turned his attention to the troubling rise of the far right, both in America and around the world. In 2019, Alex led the creation of the Global Forum on Bigotry and Hate, a kind of mobile think tank of which I, Andrew Woolford, and our guest here, the distinguished Argentinian scholar Daniel Feierstein, are members, so we're all members of the same cluster. Alex's critical engagement with extremism is likewise visible in his recent publications, such as 2021's It Can Happen Here, White Power, and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US. partly as a result of his efforts to draw attention to the growing presence of contemporary manifestations of white supremacy in the United States, which he compares to the way identity politics and genocidal criminality converged during the Cambodian genocide. Alex was awarded the American Anthropological Association's 2022 Anthropology in Media Award for raising awareness of genocide and human rights. Last year, he also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Network of Genocide Scholars. Having now lowered everyone's expectations, I now invite Dr. Alex Hinton to speak to us today about white power and the rising threat of great replacement hate.
Yeah, for a minute, I didn't think I actually needed to do anything else. These different stories. What was the that discussion, the rarefied? I remember it was about the sublime. Did you remember that? Or? Oh, see, he was over my head. He knew the other part. I was still back on the sublime. Anyways, thank you all. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. And the title, it could be, what is going on in the U.S. right now? I'm going to speak to that, maybe. Another one could be, it can happen here 2.0. And then we have the title, and I'll speak to all of the above. But to begin, I want to start with a preface. Free speech, diversity, faith and family, inclusion, common sense, equity, liberty, critical race theory, equality, transgender, patriotism. And I'll return to this at the end, time permitting. So again, thank you, Adam, for the nice introduction, the generous one, and Stan as well. Much appreciated. The game, fun. I'm not sure it's going to be fun, but hopefully it'll be a little bit interesting, fun. This topic, it's a little more dicey, but we'll try and make it sort of fun along the way, and it is sort of the game works well as a metaphor, and I appreciate that. And thanks to the Morrow Institute, to MLT Aikins, and the Peace and Conflict Studies program. To begin with, a note on terminology. There's a lot of terminology, but these are some of the ones I'm going to get going with. So I'm going to be speaking about CPAC. How many of you have ever heard of CPAC? Oh, okay. That's a fair number of people. So this is the Conservative Political Action Conference that's held in Washington, D.C. at the National Harbor in February every year, and it was just held a couple weeks ago from the 20th to the 22nd. How many of you have heard of Principles First? That's not oh, okay. One person, that's not a surprise. This is the counter conservative group that puts principles first, that meets at the same time as CPAC. They start a day later, and it goes through Sunday, so it goes to the 23rd. I'm sure you've all heard of the Proud Boys, which is a far-right extremist group. They call themselves a men's group, male chauvinist group, lots of different names. It's led, or was led, by Enrique Tarrio, and he was sent to prison after the January 6th insurrection in the U.S., and then he was pardoned along with hundreds of other J6ers, as they call themselves, by President Trump on his first day in office. I'm sure you're all familiar with MAGA, but just in case, Make America Great Again, MAGA, I'll be using that term a lot. And this is both a slogan, but it's also a mission. That's the way it's deployed. So I want to begin at principles first. Again, this is the counter CPAC meeting. After I went to CPAC, different reasons, but I said I'm going to go to this other context, and I showed up at Principles First. They have people in the MAGAverse called these Republicans rhinos, Republican in name only, and there's a degree of tension. So Adam Kinzinger, Bolton spoke, Mark Cuban spoke, a bunch of different people. When I was there, you can see the exhibition hall. I was curious to see Rich Logis, who I know. He's someone who was very deeply in the MAGA world, and he left the MAGA world sort of over COVID, and I've spoken with him about his journey, and he had a booth. So I went up and I started to talk to him. This was around noon, and suddenly someone said, "Bomb scare." So a message was sent in the name of Terrio. It was untraceable. He denies that it was him, and quite possibly it wasn't, because the Proud Boys have a lot of infighting at the moment. Some people regard him as an informer. But the day before, Terrio had shown up at the conference, and he had gotten into a shouting match trying to harass a DC officer who was also at the Capitol on the day of the insurrection. And that made the news. You know, when I arrived there was a lot of security. I was just thinking, you know, why is there all this security? And this turned out to be the reason. Terrio was busy the day, you know, earlier in the day. He had gone in DC to a meeting near the Capitol, obviously chosen because it was near the Capitol insurrection, to announce that he and other former January 6 political prisoners, if you're on the right, hostages, if you're on the right, persecuted, if you're on the right, insurrectionists, if you're on the left. So the term J6er is a MAGAverse term, that they were suing the Department of Justice. So they are. So this was announced. Terrio, you know, he'd been around in CPAC. I was walking through to get food, and I looked over in the bar. So well, I recognize that guy. He was in the bar. He was at CPAC. So this is the way it began. And here we have, you know, to honor the J6 hostages, you see the language, recently released by Emperor Trump. And, you know, I put these pipe bombs, and there are all these people, these rhinos, I'm going to get them, and they all deserve to die. So, you know, this made the news. We had to leave the hotel for about 2 hours. I am going to circle back to that at the end of my talk, time permitting. But again, it sounds like most people are familiar with the Proud Boys. You got to sort of like, you know, what's it like in the States? It's kind of mind-blowing. I think it's mind-blowing for many people. But we have people who attacked the Capitol. There was an attempt to prevent the election results from being processed and going through. People stormed the Capitol, so wherever country, Canada, wherever, if you're from other parts, imagine people storming the Capitol and trying to stop it. They get put in jail, and then they're pardoned and released, and suddenly they're back at the Capitol, right, saying that we were unjustly accused. We're suing the government of the person who pardoned them. So, you know, this is all going to play out through time. But just, you note there, this is a hard thing when I speak. I sometimes imitate the people I'm speaking, and I almost was going to make the OK sign, which for those who know is the white power sign, where you make the OK, it's like a P going down, 3 fingers up, white power. So you see them outside the Capitol during the insurrection doing their white power sign. And again, just to underscore the Proud Boys and Terrio, they were the people, along with Oath Keepers, who were most visibly and at the forefront of the assault on the Capitol. The head of the Oath Keepers was also at CPAC. At one point, I was down in the exhibition hall, and I looked over, and Steve Bannon was there. How many of you have heard of Steve Bannon? Is he? Whoa, Okay, I'm not going to ask if you're members of the posse. I'm not going to follow up. That's what he calls the people who listen to the war room. But he was broadcasting live, and he had Rhodes, the head of the Oath Keepers, was up there, along with another person and their lawyer, and they were talking about how they were going to sue the government. So it was kind of strange. So for me, it was particularly kind of, it was odd in a lot of ways. But when I wrote my book, It Can Happen Here, it sort of went through the first Trump administration, written for the most part in a first-person narrative, talking about everything from sort of classroom experiences, teaching my students about genocide, mass atrocity, how to predict political violence, moving, literally up to George Floyd. And as a little George Floyd aside, today someone who spoke at CPAC announced and said, oh, we should pardon the police officer who killed George Floyd. That was today. We were sort of joking, it's no joke. It's like you literally have to check the news every 10 or 15 minutes to update whatever you're talking about, so it's continuous. But that was one thing that floated out. And so we'll see if that happens. You may also know that and there was someone being held in Romania in the manosphere who also was sent back to the US, Tate. So stuff is happening, a lot of it because everyone's paying attention to things like tariff wars. This stuff sort of gets washed behind. And this is part of the point. As Steve Bannon said at CPAC, these are days of thunder and lightning. It's intentional strategy. Make it so everyone's like deer in the headlights. You can't see anything. You're dazed and confused. And really, what's it like to be in the U.S.? I don't know, other parts of the world, but people are kind of dazed and confused. It's like the people on the left, I don't want to say they're dysfunctional, but they are not active. So it's kind of a scary time in the U.S., and maybe you'll be a little more scared by the time I'm done. But the book ended there, and here we are 4 years later. I'm at CPAC, there's a bomb threat, and I'm thinking, my book ended. I wrote a preface that ended with insurrection. I'm thinking to myself, here we are again. And so I may, hopefully we'll publish a new edition that will sort of update, recontextualize it, though the sort of stuff that was written about then is relevant. So, as I said, part of the framing today is I want to talk about It Can Happen Here 2.0, Trump 2.0, It Can Happen Here 2.0. So the original title of the book was White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide, though really it talks about political violence more broadly, with that being the sort of endpoint, or the furthest instantiation of that violence. And certainly, if you go back to the insurrection, we got there, and sometimes I like to point out, imagine if Trump had not been cut off of Twitter, because that really stopped him from being able to communicate. Like, what if that had not happened? Things could have kept going, and I'm going to loop into that as well. So what's the it? And It Can Happen Here 2.0. Well, the it could be authoritarianism, fascism, totalitarianism, political violence, mass atrocities or atrocity crimes, genocide. Those are all sort of things that are bundled into that it. But I want to sort of begin, and then I'm going to wander into different currents of this, by talking about three things that could be already or may happen in the U.S. The first is democratic backsliding and the move to a version of soft authoritarianism that maybe moves towards the Orban model. At CPAC, there's actually CPAC in Hungary. People from CPAC Hungary come and they speak at CPAC. So, not saying that's the end point, but arguably democratic backsliding is well underway already. The second possibility is political violence, and the third is white power extremism. To sort of go back to each of these in turn quickly. If we think what makes up a democracy, representative government, rights being upheld, an impartial administration. Everyone says, I hate bureaucracy. But actually in the States, we found out, we kind of like those bureaucrats because they're a buffer. And obviously, everyone's aware of the assault on that buffer that's taking place as we speak. Impartial administration, participatory engagement. Arguably, all 5 of those sort of checks and balances, those bedrocks, are being eroded as we speak. I have things on purpose that were going on before Trump took office. And what's kind of remarkable is we saw it all. Basically, everything up there is happening in the States. Yeah, 1 month in, this is where we are. Second, in terms of political violence, I'll give you very quick and simple. It's actually complicated, but an example will sort of bring it home. I talked to you about 2020 in the US in 2024. The biggest worry was that we would have violence, at different offices, places, balloting offices, officials would be attacked, and that we would have another election that was contested. Fast forward to 4 more years, 2028. But in this case, President Trump is in office, and he's able to manipulate things, and he knows how to do so. If I had to guess right now, I would say we're going to be in a really bad spot when we get to the 2028 election, and bad stuff could potentially go down. I guess I've already talked about the it of white power extremism, bomb scare, a formerly incarcerated January 6th prisoner emboldened to, as I say, have a press conference where he batted someone's arm down. He was arrested, feels, confident enough to go out and harass a DC police officer who was, on TV on CNN all the time, talking about what had happened. And then again, we don't know if this was him, but someone, sent a bomb scare to Principles First, saying they all deserve to die. I told you it wasn't going to be fun. You're getting depressed, yeah. Welcome to the life in the U.S., unless you're in the MAGA verse, in which it's the best time ever in the history of the world. So again, in terms of the extremism, here's a little wave to a comment made by someone on a Proud Boy Telegram channel talking about extinction, which is a code word for something I wrote about in my book. I had a chapter on white genocide. This idea, if you want to see a movie, there's a movie, actually I think it was made in Canada, called The Order, about the 1980s group, the Order, and they were inspired, and they actually, has anyone seen The Order, out of curiosity? A couple. So they hold up copies of the Turner Diaries, which is basically a plan to overthrow the government, but the endpoint of that government is the destruction of everyone who's not white. All the race traitors are going to be strung up and hung. I assume you're not going to read it, so I can tell you they kill everyone who's not white in the world and ends up with a giant white world. That's the endpoint. And so it's like looking back at the history of this revolution. So this is called like the Bible of the racist right, white power, scripture. Yeah, so that directly influenced The Order in the 1980s, this group that went about, did bad stuff, robbed banks, killed one person. And one of the people from The Order was arrested, this guy Lane, who appears in the movie kind of briefly as a background character. He wrote this thing called the White Genocide Manifesto. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it's basically, the U.S. is controlled by a Zog government, Zionist-occupied government. And you talk about the notion, for those who like the matrix, of the red pill and the blue pill. The problem with that metaphor is that everybody has a red pill to offer you. take your red pill of become a neo-Nazi, take your red pill, become an incel, take your red pill and become a communist. Everyone's offering red pills, and that's where that sort of metaphor breaks down. So this is, again, and so people in the white power movement talk about being red pill, blue pill, or actually all sorts of different pills. But this is a truth, and he lays it out in this manifesto. And of course, there's the standard anti-Semitic stuff that goes on in it: Zionist control, Zionist destroyer. There's also race figures prominently, sort of hearkening back to early 20th century literature, like the Rising Tide of Color. You sort of get this language that pops up, a tidal wave of 5 billion colored. So race figures in there. And then, of course, we get the sort of what we say now is manosphere, hyper-masculinity that you also see very much with the MAGA movement being foregrounded. I mentioned tape being released. But, what's the point of women? Well, you talk to, but basically to raise white babies. White women are there to raise white babies, so you don't want to have any miscegenation because they're not white babies. You don't want to have a trans community because women who are trans are not having, right, with their biological sex, white babies. So you can see how this sort of creeps into many different spaces. Yeah, so it ends with 14 words. I won't read them out. There they are, which if you ever see someone with a 1488 tattoo, that's 14 words plus 88, Heil Hitler, which is a white power symbol. This idea spread around when we had the alt-right. It kind of rose and fell. They said, what are our ideological pillars? They wrote a manifesto. Race is real, the Jewish question is valid, and white genocide is underway. One big switch that took place was that, there are different genealogies to white power, and there's sort of different genealogies, what we call replacement, and we have this sort of distinctive one in the US that's often anti-Semitic, puts Jews at the forefront. In Europe, it's Muslims who are often at the forefront. So if you go and look at the Christchurch shooter or Anders Breivik, right, it's Muslims, the invaders, who are coming, where in the US it tends to be racially configured. But you did have this shift where you began to have a big spike of replacement discourse in Europe. And there's this in the US, when we had the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, maybe some of you remember it, you had these people in khaki pants with these little torches, and they're all going, you will not replace us. Wait, what? Jews will not replace us? Replace us. People didn't know exactly what that meant. So it sort of marked this move of the European replacement language into more of a mainstream discourse in the white power circles of white genocide in the US. And so if you look at later mass shootings in the US, like Robert Bowers, he talks about bringing the invaders in. There was the mass shooter at the Walmart in Texas. He talks about the invasion of Texas. And then we have, you may remember more recently, the Peyton Gendron shooting at the Tops Buffalo in New York, 2022. And it was all about, again, replacement. And, a lot of these, they have their manifestos and then they cut and paste and copy and plagiarize each other. But so not much of it is original, but they like it when people read it. Yeah, so here, here we are with the 3 its of it can happen here. And I always like to, one of the sort of scholars in terms of this sort of waves to the genocide studies bucket that I work in, and I always use this essay when I teach Education After Auschwitz by a German philosopher, Adorno, who also, if anyone's ever heard the term cultural Marxist, which is used by the right, it's the genealogy of woke. Actually, it goes like woke, political correctness, and then it goes back to the cultural Marxists, members of the Frankfurt School, most of whom were Jewish, came to the US. Adorno was one of them. But he said, the premier demand on all education is that Auschwitz not happen again. Sort of an early rendering of never again. So what's interesting is, he's writing this in the 60s. He's not writing, he gave his public radio address. And for Adorno, the point was that the preconditions of mass violence of the Nazis was not an aberration. It was something that's built into the structure of modern society. So Auschwitz, you know, I don't want to put it in quotes, but Auschwitz in the sense of the potential for mass violence, industrial death, horrible human rights abuses, is always with us. And for Adorno, the whole point of teaching was to teach people to critically self-reflect. His form of self-reflection, you know, as a sort of neo-Marxist, depressed Marxist, he was a very depressed Marxist, what have you, that's part of how he analyzed the structures of society. But however it is, it's something that other people, Hannah Arendt, with her discussions of the Nazi bureaucrat Adolf Eichmann, have talked about. And I'm gonna, time permitting, loop around and talk about more later. So, you know, what is he talking about? He says, well, we have to teach about the mechanisms, right? What made Auschwitz possible? How is it that people can become like this? We have to teach students and people to understand how this stuff works, but also to liberate them from, if I'm gonna use another term that we use now, their bubbles, right? Or in anthropology, we talk about culture as a medium of growth, right? Like a petri dish that gives rise to our subjectivity, our identity. So for Adorno, it's all about becoming critically self-reflecting, because he'd given up on a Marxist revolution. He talked about, you know, one of the mechanisms, one of the primary ones he talked about was reification. It's a fancy word for thingification, turning, if you will, fluid, dynamic processes, right, into something that's static and hypothesizes. A couple of quick examples. I'm not going to ask how many people have used the word introvert or extrovert recently. Don't raise your hand, but I expect it's more than a few. So Adorno says, look, once I was in the US and there was someone who I worked with, and she said to me, Professor Adorno, are you an introvert or an extrovert? And he said, in that one moment, she asked me to take the complexity of my being and reduce it down to one word, to thingify. You know, he would be thingifying his consciousness. Another example for anyone, how many of you have read Maus? Anyone? Oh, okay, so this is, yeah. So Maus 1, Vladek, the father who's in hiding, passing, in Poland, trying not to be recognized as being a Jew, is walking along, passing, and a Polish kid goes, look, look, a Jew. And so in that moment, his identity shifts, complexity of his being is narrowed down, he's reified. So again, for Adorno, you know, you need to rupture reification, and he characterized it as well, and more broadly, the authoritarian personality, through the terms of being cold, coldness, and hardness. You know, it says a lot more, but that's a key part of it. Now, this is uncomfortable. See, it's not just the Nazis. It's not just the Proud Boys. It's not just the person who made that threat, the bomb threat at Principles First, who reify. It's all of us as well. It's part of the human condition. So when we think abstractly, and we have to, we go insane if we didn't, we constantly reify. And so for Adorno, as a little sort of backdrop, the struggle is always to be sort of self-reflecting on the categories that we are using. So if we say, look at the Proud Boys, they're a bunch of Nazi, fascist haters. That's a reification. So Adorno's challenge is, even if categories are used, they're done thoughtfully with analysis, and it's not easy. So I want to spend the rest of the time I guess 20 minutes, something like that, yeah. Sort of diving into, a way to deal with reification, prevention. I also work in the space of depolarization, bridging organizations. I do ethnographic research. And so I'm going to sort of land on three intertwined pieces of this. One is to talk a little bit about moral compass, to talk about empathetic listening, and this one's kind of a tough one. And also what Adorno liked to talk about, historicizing and denaturalizing, which is if we're using terms, if we're thinking about events, we need to historicize them and we need to unpack them. So that's Adorno's two-pronged, he offers that as a way to prevent mass atrocity, two-pronged way for people to critically self-reflect. And that'll be behind what I say. Fans of The Matrix, besides me, has anyone seen all four of the movies? Wow. Now, this is strange. I've never been with this many people who've seen all four of them. Okay. So the train station. Train station's hard to get to. That's the space where you're kind of not in a bubble. You're standing outside of everything. So, I do MAGA anthropology, anthropological research into the MAGA movement. I've been doing it for quite some time. And people sometimes say, well, what are you doing? But it's sort of like, I don't know, the neo thing, it's got issues there. But the idea is you try and go into a different space and you try and unpack the code, if you will, as happens in The Matrix. That's what anthropologists do. My original field research was in Cambodia. You go in, what's the number one trick? My Professor Frederick Bart taught me is you make a bunch of mistakes and then you figure out how it works. And that's part of what you do. You learn through your mistakes and you build up models of how things work. You unpack the code. We do this in different sorts of ways. So when I went to CPAC, and this is my third CPAC, I go in as an anthropologist and I'm trying to understand the code. I'm trying to understand how things work, if you will, from, as Clifford Geertz put it, from the natives' point of view. I'm trying to step in and immerse myself in that context. And this is where, this is hard and it can make people uncomfortable. But in anthropology, and actually in depolarization work, these are people who try and bring reds and blues together to dialogue. A key thing is empathetic engagement, and there are two types. There are different types, but I'm just going to use two for the sake of this talk. One is cognitive, which would be sort of, you think of it as unpacking that code. The other, and this is really hard in a context like CPAC, is affective. This is feeling with, and this is tricky. So I do interviews with torturers in Cambodia. I've done those. You enter into that intersubjective space with another human being and you try and understand them. If you're simply doing cognitive empathy, you'll get part of it, but it's really sinking into belief in the feelings that go with it that you get much deeper understandings. It doesn't mean that you flip over and become, whatever you're studying, but to really have understanding, you need both of these types of empathy. And I would argue in good depolarization work, this is true as well. So in the remainder of the time that I have here, I want to take you through my research at CPAC, and I'm going to organize this around the senses: touch, taste, hearing, sight, smell. And did you know there are more than 5 senses? Yeah, some people do. It's like, balance and movement. I'm going to end up there. So I basically have given you touch, which is empathy as opposed to coldness and hardness of the type that the Proud Boys or a neo-Nazi group do, where they reify people. Touch is reaching out and trying to empathetically connect. Taste, it's like, what is it like to be there? I've been asked that many times. What's it like to be in that space, to get a taste of it, to get a sense for it? You know, what is the space like? What are the people, sounds? What's the, you know, I've written articles, they say add color to your article, give details. So I don't have a lot of time to get into that, but I'll give you a little bit of an example. CPAC, well, next year it's going to be in Dallas, but the ones I've been to have been at the Gaylord Hotel, Resort Hotel. And you have a bottom level with an exhibition hall, always fascinating, lots of stories. You know, so I told you the War Room is being broadcast live, Bandon's War Room, from the exhibition hall. There's a radio row that's next to the main stage. It's filled with right-wing media. People will speak, they go out, they're interviewed, there's a constant bustle. Those on the leaning left would probably always be depressed because it's a very vibrant media, robust presence. And then you sort of go off that into the main stage. You walk in, several thousand seats, giant red, blue, and white stage. There's always a slogan. Last year was an interesting one, where globalism goes to die. They said, well, globalism's now pretty much dead, so they switched to protecting America now. And the speakers come in, they stand, give 8-minute talks. Sometimes they'll sit on a couch. J.D. Vance did the first one, sitting down, being interviewed. And there's lots of MAGA bling. It's all over the place. MAGA this, MAGA that. You know, MAGA socks, Trump, the golden age, jokes about the Gulf of America. There's a Trump bus, and people go and say things like, Trump, you are anointed and appointed, sign their name. It's like Comic-Con. I assume you're all familiar with Comic-Con. It's Trump-a-con. It's like you dress up. It's a festival. You know, it's that feeling with. It's hard to describe. You get caught up with it. I mean, when I'm there, I get caught up in the energy. It's like Durkheim, a social theorist, described it as effervescence. People are bubbling up, right? Like champagne, effervesce. It's like that. Just people are hyped up. They're jubilant. They're happy. As I said, it's very different than people in the blue bubble who are completely the opposite way. So it's a Trumpicon. You see the little deportation center they have there where you can go up and get your photograph taken with Trump and Tom Homans. The borders are, people traipse around. This from 2023. Lots of bling. You go in on the CPAC stage and it's thunderous music. There are advertisements nonstop. Last year when I was there, they were constantly having evil, quote unquote, evil professors who supported Hamas being demonized, radical left, woke socialists, you know, just blaring over and over again. There are other ones about how, you know, abortion's horrible, Christian, evangelical Christian groups. There are ones for Patriot Mobile. So there's a whole, again, sort of business, conservative business that's circulating there. Yeah, so, and I have to say, almost everyone is dressed up. I had some problems because I can't wear a MAGA cap, so I got a one that says like America on it, like a little generic Walmart cap. Yeah, so that's what I wear, because if you don't wear that, you look kind of odd. You stand out, especially if you're typing notes. That looks really weird. People are always looking. And if you don't applaud, no. So, you know, that's one of the problems of being an anthropologist in this context. Yeah, and guess who the heroes, the stars, as I mentioned before. And to say that, I mean, again, January 6th, insurrectionists being welcomed as heroes, and that's not an exaggeration. They were stars. People would look at them. There, one night at the bar, a bunch of Proud Boys got up and they were doing the Trump fight, fight, fight. People hold their fists, go fight, 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 which is what Trump did when there was the assassination attempt on him. It's a world of us and them. Constant references to us and them as if we should all know. So people will say they tried to assassinate President Trump. To Trump's credit, he said a deranged person tried to kill me when he gave his talk there on the last day. Yeah. Hearing, so this is really this is difficult. Probably everyone's had political fights with someone else, right? Family members. In the US, this happens a lot now, and it's not pleasant. The hardest thing to do, try it if you've never done it, is to bite your tongue, to listen, and to not use the word but. Yeah, probably no one's ever done that, right? I had to learn I had training from anthropology where you learn to just listen. So if I'm talking to someone, as I said before, torture, someone who shot people, mass executions, I don't jump in and say stuff, you just listen and try and understand from their point of view. This is actually, when I started doing my depolarization work, it's the same thing. They train people to listen with curiosity, without jumping in, and without sort of saying, now it's my turn. It's really hard to do. So that's what I do when I'm at CPAC. I just listen. I soak it in. I listen with curiosity, with empathy, cognitive empathy, and effective empathy. The talks this year, they were a little bit not as good as in the past. And by that, I mean, they must put a lot of thought in. This year, I think everyone was so happy with the joyous golden age that they had kind of flat titles for the sessions. It used to be like the Biden crime family, sacking the woke playbook, caging the red dragon. This year, we had some. First, I should just note, and this may be with Professor Firestein's talk tomorrow, CPAC is global. MAGA is a global movement, and they have representatives from all over the world who are there, leaders from countries from all over the world, including the president of Argentina, who gave Elon Musk a chainsaw. Maybe some of you saw that. It's sort of a different story. I'm not really talking about that today. Maybe you'll talk about that tomorrow. It's global, but you get a sense for these different, titles that come up. So you sit, sessions start early in the morning. They go to like 5, 6 o'clock. I sit there for the whole thing. Most people go in and out. What am I doing? I'm sort of taking it in, right? Visual images. I'm listening for silences and the unsaid. So one thing that's pretty obvious pretty soon is you don't cross the boss. You don't break the party line, as back in the Khmer Rouge days, I would say that. Rich Logis, the person I mentioned from leaving MAGA, said, when you're in MAGA, you do not contradict the ideas. You don't speak up. You toe the line. This is very much true at CPAC. Everyone's on message. It's convincing. Everyone's saying the same thing with passion, with conviction. No one's going to mention global warming. You get the green news scam instead. There was not one mention of Gaza. Lots of mention of Israel. Not one mention of Gaza suffering, I think. Russia, it's thumbs up to Russia. Ukraine, they just took a bunch of US money. Nobody mentions Russian war crimes. Nobody talks about enslavement or indigenous peoples except for Levin, a Fox News host, who said the reason we should not have birthright citizenship for, as they're called there, quote unquote, aliens or illegals, illegal aliens, those terms are used frequently at CPAC, is because birthright citizenship was actually done to give the enslaved, that's not the word he used, the ability to be citizens, and it wasn't meant for this invasion of immigrants. So again, besides that, there's no mention of sort of the darker sides of US history. Gay marriage is going to be, I'm predicting in future CPACs, maybe something that begins to be opened up right now. It's because of the evangelical Christian dimension of CPAC, where gay marriage is not really, for many, not all, but many people do that favorably because God created men and women. This also goes to the anti-trans rhetoric. People are uneasy, so no one mentions it. Nobody talks about it. And Trump and, the crimes that were committed, no. You talk about the big lie, stop the steal, witch hunt, fake news, so on and so forth. So I'm attending to it. I'm carrying out thematic analysis. In the old days, Frederick Barth taught me you build up models, and then at some point, some government agency said, oh, those anthropologists or social scientists don't have hardcore true methods. So some people came up with thematic analysis and couched it in language, but it's basically looking for language that recurs, right? And what's unsaid, and looking for themes. And that's what Frederick Bart taught me way back when I had my ethnographic methods class. So here's some of the stuff, from my notes that would pop up. I'm going along, I'm listening, I'm writing notes, I'm taping, and I'm writing down themes as I'm going between sessions. And these are different things: Christian nationalism, deep state, golden age, lawfare, invader, threat, woke, make America, make everything great again, because whatever country you're from, make Great Britain great again, so on and so forth. And especially those evil radical left Marxists, elitists, academics, front and center. Academics are not popular. And then, of course, everything's just common sense. Yeah, so you'll hear this over and over again. It's common sense to do this. It's common sense to go in and cut thousands and tens of thousands of government jobs, including now 70,000 plus at the VA. Yeah, to sort of conclude, if I can get 5, 6, 7 more minutes. I got a reluctant nod. Okay, thumbs up, I feel better now. Yeah, so this all lays as a scholar, which I'm there, is the ability for these 2 other senses I'm going to talk about. Sight, which is to be able to understand it, to have insight. And so in depolarization language, bridging language, so this is hard. Imagine you're talking to your relative, you have completely different politics. The method is that you listen and then you say, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying, and you repeat back. That shows that you've understood it. That's hard. That's really hard to do for a lot of people. But that's part of what, I'm sort of there to do, is to offer explainers, if you will, about what's going on. I'm going to talk about two different types of engagement. So with this one, I got into another MAGA meeting. I knew that the term golden age was floating around. First time I heard it, it sounded really weird. People say the U.S. is going into a golden age. But sure enough, I knew it was going to be prominent. It kicked off Trump's inaugural address. He said we're in a golden age. He just gave a State of the Union a couple nights ago. He used golden age at the beginning. It's golden age, golden age, golden age. And you see the Trump jacket. So the next phase, right, in terms of doing this anthropology of MAGA, is to unpack things. But I am publishing, as opposed to doing academic articles, I'm trying to do public-facing articles that can reach a broad audience. And so this is when I publish about the golden age. So it's people say, well, what's going on? Why are people happy? And you have to sort of go back to understand that Trump, the framing of Trump's journey is that of a hero who was assaulted by different forces, like the assassination attempt, the mobilization of the government against him, what's called lawfare. And he's this hero, and literally called a hero. Steve Bannon referred to him as a gladiator. You get this type of language, who conquered the evil forces. And now that he's in power, they use the metaphor of a bull in a china shop or a wrecking ball. He's going to tear down the evil structures that exist. And of course, as a businessman, he has the Midas touch, and he has a book called The Midas Touch that he wrote. Whatever he touches turns to gold, people will say this. And we have this vision that was, again, he spoke about in the State of the Union, of this sort of state of American exceptionalism restored. People, I'm not going to go into this, people said, why did Trump win? I'm asked this frequently. I wrote another one that sort of went through based on my research and explained why Trump, why people voted for Trump. I did one for Harris as well. I'm not going to go into another part of this, which is sort of tracing the demons of CPAC, but I've written about this. You can look up my name, conversation, a bunch of stuff will appear. I want to get into, last thing before I conclude, just very quickly, smell. That means the smell test. I said this to my kids. I was like, you know the smell test? They're like, what? And I asked my wife, you know the smell test? She was, what? And I realized, how many of you have heard of the smell test? Oh, okay, well, thank you. Okay, they made me feel like I was, something was wrong. So I said, well, it smells fishy. Everybody knows that one. So, that's another dimension of research. And I'm not going to dive deeply into this. I had a lot of other stuff I could say, as you'll see from all the slides I flipped by. But, so what happened with that smell test? Well, Steve Bannon gave a salute. Probably some of you saw that on social media. One French far-right speaker said, I'm not going to speak at CPAC because someone was doing sort of neo-Nazi stuff. So Steve Bannon did that. See, I told you I'm always, keep the arm down. So he threw his arm out just like Elon Musk had done. J.D. Vance spoke. So there are many different white power undercurrents that flow. I mentioned birthright citizenship, the salute, Christian nationalism, attacks on woke agenda DEI, which many people, some people on the pretty far on the left talk about Jim Crow 2.0 being reimposed. So you have these strong white power undercurrents. I'm just going to very quickly go back and loop back to the top because it's in the title of the talk, to one about hardness. So this is today. I told you, you have to check the news every 15 minutes. Elon Musk did an interview with Rogan, and in that he said, you see it right there, the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. And so that, as you know, is exactly the opposite of what I'm arguing for, and it's what I think Adorno would have said is an example of being hard, being cold. And so he said this, but he says other things as well in the same interview. He invoked great replacement conspiracy theory. It's this idea that Democrats, who, by the way, did I mention they 57%, right, of the Latino vote, and a massive rise up to 37, 38, don't quote me on that, double check it, always check statistics, of the black male vote. Made a lot of inroads, but apparently the belief is that Democrats have this plan to bring in a bunch of quote unquote illegals and turn them into Democrats, and then they're going to win every state and stay in power forever. No, this is like this used to be off on the fringes. It's mainstream now. These are talking points that barely anyone ever comments on. This is a mainstream talking point. So he invoked that in this Rogan interview. He also, when I was sitting there listening to him after he put down his chainsaw, he invoked this great replacement conspiracy theory at CPAC as well on stage. And there's another scholar who's sort of gone back and looked at all the different white power things that Musk has done, and there appear to be many of them. But as I said, great replacement is mainstream. Tucker Carlson was one of the engines of mainstreaming it. It's all over the place. What is it? I should have mentioned, right? It's this idea that they're out to replace the white population, but also because Trump supporters historically have been predominantly white, many evangelical Christian, older. There's this alignment with voters and racial identity. And so it has this one sort of political version, which is replace voters, so you can turn it into a party of those non-whites, quote unquote, right? The Democrats versus the Republicans are predominantly white. So those discourses intertwine. And then there's the overt white power replacement idea, which is Jews are out, in the US version, Jews are out to destroy the white population, and they manipulate other non-white groups to help do that, which is why the Buffalo top shooter said, well, Jews are controlling it all, but he went in and wanted to attack the predominantly black population in Buffalo because they were sort of underneath the Jews and being manipulated by them. That was his reasoning. Yeah, J.D. Vance, we don't have time to get into him. He was the first speaker. He did the widely discussed idea that Haitian immigrants, who they now are deporting en masse in Ohio, were eating their pets, right? And this circulated. Some of you may have seen that. It got brought up at the debate. And people like Charlie Kirk, Stephen Miller also served. So you've got this robust media ecology, things are cycling all the way through. Replacement was a massive motivation for many of the people of the Capitol insurrectionists. If you want to go into this a little more deeply, I wrote a piece in today's Totalitarianisms that looks at sort of the broader history of replacement. Trump the snake, beginning of my book. Don't have time to talk about that. Yeah, so I want to come back and finish up by thinking of the different senses I mentioned as a form of moral compass that all of us can use in our actions that enable us to act and to move in the world. We need to move with empathy, empathetic understanding, to try and taste or touch and understand a context and all of its sensory vibrancy, to understand what's going on, attune to things experientially. We need to listen to understand, not to use the but word, but to listen with curiosity until we can get to the point of having insight to be able to articulate, if we're talking in terms of a different domain like the Magaverse, or wherever you are, how people in this context understand things. And then, as is appropriate, depending on who we are and what our goals are, to offer critique, as I do when I wrote about white replacement and the quote-unquote pet-eating replacement conspiracy theory that circulated. And as I did at the beginning of this presentation, when I mixed words that currently are under assault in the US, where free speech is diminishing and where people were afraid to speak out. But when I did that, I also mixed it with MAGA words to bring them into, it'd be too simple to simply say a list of words that are being attacked, but to bring them into conversation with other discourses that are circulating. So that's, again, a form of simple little act of critique. Maybe I'll do it at all the talks I give, I don't know. But I did it particularly here to give another little example of that sort of smell test. Yeah, and so to conclude, last thing, Rich Logis, who started Leaving MAGA, is trying to do it. The people at Principles First said, we're not going to let them stop us from speaking. In the US right now, many people are afraid to speak. They're worried they will be attacked on the internet, join the evil professors 100 list. I'm not on it, knock on wood so far, but yeah, it's a bad situation. So I apologize. It's not a cheery message, but it's really difficult times in the US. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it, and thank you for the invitation to speak.
I'm glad I set up there because I needed some time just to take a deep breath and think about what you were saying. As a student and learner in leadership studies, I can relate to your sense of a smell test. And what they say, and biologists in the room might affirm, that when a fish begins to rot, it begins to smell, right? But when a fish begins to rot, it rots from the head down. So how appropriate. We're going to turn this over to you for questions and answers, but maybe I can start this off with a question that I had in mind. You, an anthropologist entering into a room to do research, and so you kind of abide by the principles of research and what it means to be a researcher, and you're seeking to understand the words. A man on the street, if I'm convinced that I'm right, and I'm convinced that you're wrong, do we even want to converse with each other? Is empathy, or let alone listening, even possible? How might you speak to that?
Yeah, no, great question. I was going to say sign up for a class at a university, right, is like one thing we can do. But this is where the onus can't be placed upon the other person. It's upon us. If we're the ones who want to reach out and have a dialogue, it's incumbent upon us to act accordingly. I skipped over a few slides, one of which was going back and talking about Hannah Arendt, her notion of the public sphere. The idea of the public sphere is you enter into it after you've thought through. You don't have unformed opinions. You've done analysis. You've critically self-reflected. And then you go in with judgments into the public sphere and listen to other people. You listen to them. And then you go back and do what you call the 2-in-1, which is like an internal Socratic dialogue. But, you know, I'll listen, I'll talk to anyone. You know, it goes to like, well, if you have your relative who you seem to, you know, have lots of trouble with, how do you have a dialogue? You know, strategies for that, besides listen, is you don't jump into the middle of the fire, right? That's not going to go anywhere. You start with, one of the things that's often done, you know, I work with one group called Urban Rural Action. It's a small grassroots NGO. I've been following them and watching what they do, and they bring reds and blues. They actually bring people from urban and rural contexts together. They build trust. They work together. They hang out. They have a project. It's not like you just suddenly, oh, we're in agreement. No, it takes time. Maybe they disagree. But you know what? In the end, even if they disagree, they listen to each other. So again, you know, we're back to moral compass. Someone can decide not to do anything. That's a possible decision. It's not the one I make. My decision is is why I framed it this way, is to write in the public sphere, to do critique when necessary, to teach about this. That's what I do. But each and every one of us have different abilities if we want to do it in different ways. It could be playing cards with someone, having a conversation. But I'm telling you, if you go into it, I'm going to win the argument. If you go into it, I'm right. If you go into it and say, but, you're just going to be back where it was before. It's really hard to listen and to bite your tongue and to be curious. But guess what? You may find out things that you didn't know about. You may find out and come to think some of the things you thought were based on false assumptions or were wrong. So you learn a lot. And for me, going into the MAGAverse, you know, I understand how people, everything that's going on now, I understand it. I understand the logics of it because I've been in there and I've listened. I may not agree with it, but I understand it. It's not easy, but to me, in terms of moral compass, that's the step that I've chosen to make. That's my movement forward after doing all these different, as I put it, sensory things.
Thank you. Yes, we'll have Jason has got a mic. He'll come over and please just raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you. And thank you. And before you ask that question, I want to just affirm that as you are here, we're also streaming this presentation and talk to, I don't know how many people out there. We'll know tomorrow, but there are more than one, I am sure.
You're talking about my family members.
Thank you. I follow CPAC avidly. I follow it all very avidly, and I see CPAC as the mythologizing, script writing, and fundraising activity of the elite of the Trumpian universe. And I grew up in post-war Winnipeg in the North End. I don't know if I mentioned, I have probably too much education, but I'm a retired lawyer. So the concern that I have and what interests me is, while all this is going on, we are seeing have you done a filter or do you know of any of the research that relates to the fact that like Weimar Germany after the reparations, where people were basically starving, this is again being inflicted on the people of America in the FAFO. Everyone's familiar with FAFO. It's screw around and find out. So those are the people, the voters that Trump said, vote once because you won't have to vote again next time. The desperation that the individual MAGA voter that all these scripts float down to, has there been any research on how that artificial poverty that's being imposed with the tax breaks and the trillions of dollars, how that actually reflects on empathy, how people break not because they're not listening, but because they're desperate. When in the post-war era, we were okay in the 50s, 60s, 70s, because things were building up. Everyone had a chance. Even people who were horrible enemies in Europe who came over here as immigrants, right? They tended to leave that at the door. And some of these animosities were people who would see people who killed their families in the street. But yet we did not have this desperation. And it appears to be that anytime there is a civil war that is being created, it's being created by imposing artificial poverty. Oh, and I'm going to reflect on Martin Luther King being killed when he started his People's Campaign.
Yeah, thank you for the different comments. There are a bunch of them in there, so maybe I'll just sort of speak to a couple of them. You know, I began my book, It Can Happen Here. Originally, it was actually going to, I testified at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia, which is a UN-backed hybrid tribunal, in 2015, right as Trump was sort of rising up. And I saw these sort of echoes, if you will. And originally, I was going to have a book, and then I separated out into two books. I have another book about testifying called Anthropological Witness. But it sort of began with that. And actually, you know, right at the time I was testifying, the meme of the week was Trump is Hitler. You know, I don't find that sort of direct analogy always helpful because, again, it leads us to reify, and it sort of takes us away from some of what you were talking about in terms of the diverse constituencies and interests. You know, one thing I was going to talk about, I'd skip over a couple slides. You know, at the beginning, I said, look, we all reify. It's not just like people at CPAC are in the MAGA bubble and I'm not. In a sense, we've all taken a pill, right? We're all in the matrix, if you will. We just don't know it. We may think we're sort of liberated from it. You know, this goes back to Adorno. It's a continual process of trying to get out of it. So actually, one thing I find personally, I don't know if beneficial is the right way, but it's something that I learned from this, and by listening to all sorts of right-leaning or far-right media ecosystems, is I get different sources of information that give me perspective on the information that I'm getting. Because I'll tell you, if I'm listening to MSNBC, that's a very sharp little bubble with lots of messaging in exactly the same way. So part of critical thinking, going back to de-reification, is trying to find ways to get perspective and to think about how our subjectivity and all of our bubbles, to use that metaphor, has been constituted. If you think you've liberated yourself and are standing, you know, enlightened in this position of the perfect critical self-reflector, I've got news for you, it's not possible. Adorno, in the essay, the radio-addressed essay, Education After Auschwitz, uses the term manipulative character, referring to Eichmann at one point. And he begins by saying, I'm going to say it, but I really shouldn't say it. I'm paraphrasing, obviously don't have it in front of me, so you can go check the source, always check the source. But I really sort of need to say it. So before he uses the category, he's aware he's about to reify, and he's trying to throw it into question. So here's Adorno, right? This is a great philosopher, recognizing that it's a constant struggle for himself to speak and think. It's hard to do. You know what's really comfortable? Hanging out in a bubble. A bunch of friends, right? It's good, feels good, we effervesce. So I talk about effervescence at CPAC. Most likely we were all effervescing in our own little bubbles as well. Critical thinking is uncomfortable. It's not easy, it is uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not critically thinking because it involves a decentering, a rupturing. We referred to the train station, I think back there, you know, the train station, like where's this point that's not really in the matrix, it's not really anywhere, it's the train station. They also have the sort of blank white room. as these spaces, it's really hard to get there. But it decenters the foundation of belief if you're constantly thinking critically, which is why a lot of people don't want to do it. It's much more comfortable to think you're right. Feels good. I'm right. They're wrong. Doesn't mean that you can't critique. You can't do the smell test. But what it means is it involves constantly thinking about your presuppositions and how your subjectivity, our subjectivity, one's subjectivity, is formed. Yeah, so a lot of people don't want to think critically because it's disconcerting. I feel like it's getting really depressing here. I'm going to stop there. Sorry, I'll just stop.
To play with the metaphor of a train station, I'm thinking of Harry Potter, right? I'm looking for 3.75 platform.
It's a very different train station.
So why we have used up a lot of your time. We've taken over 20 minutes of time. So how do we, one more question and then we move on. Thank you.
What do you think brings people together? I'm thinking, for example, of the World War II, where people had to face an outside threat together. And I think that brought more bonds together, where people from disparate backgrounds, and they came together to work as a team for a cause to protect themselves from an outside threat. Is there potential, for example, our climate change, things that are really going to affect whether we live or die, are facing us right now, and we're being distracted by more petty concerns, I think. How can we bring people together to face these larger threats?
More depressing. For the first part of the comment, with Rich Logos' message, and like I find, like it's a bubble of us and them. The problem is when it's us, it can go in good directions and go in bad. It can go in lots of different directions. But anyone, so we study genocide, mass violence. The us, them is the engine of horrible things, right? That's just like right there, front and center in most situations. So, going back to effervescence, but that's the thing, but we have to act in the world. And this is where we go back to sort of that moral compass stance to find ways to go forward, which is a critical stance where you've done self-reflecting and hopefully then one of us isn't going to go off and do bad stuff. But look, so what's the other where globalism goes to die? Well, so the logic in CPAC for global warming is a Green New Scam. It's a globalist agenda. It's trying to harm people in our country. So then your question, right, the next step is, well, how you want to, I'm assuming you want to act on this issue, and you've got all these people, like me too, right? All these people, well, here's a reason to listen first, to understand, to act with moral compass, because I'm telling you, if you walk in and say, what you think about the Green New Scam and are saying about globalism, it's a bunch of, baloney, I don't believe it, you're an idiot, that's not going to get you very far in a conversation, right? But if you listen and understand, build trust, have dialogue, and maybe the people who seemed anti, action on climate change, actually there's room to have conversation. There are areas to build bridges, but those will never be found if we just assume it's us versus them, we're right, they're wrong, we're smart, they're idiots, so on and so forth. So, and I just want to say, the stuff that I hear people in the bubble, because I'm in the New York metro area, right, left-leaning blue bubble, the way that people in the MAGAverse are characterized, oddly, is much like the way that people in the MAGAverse characterize people in the blue bubble where I am. A bunch of idiots, they're brainwashed. Like literally, Kirk is going, this is the guy from Turning Point USA, he goes around to campuses he's on a brainwash tour. They think that leftists, I've said it enough times, you know what I'm talking about, but yeah, it's like all these kids are being brainwashed by the leftist socialists to become communist, and they're idiots. So yeah, ultimately, moral compass is a willingness to engage other human beings with empathy, to not reify them, to listen, learn, understand the context, and at that point to be able to take action, to have that moral compass, that bedrock to move forward in the world. In another book, Man or Monster, Trial of Khmer Rouge Torture, about the head of the S-21 Central Prison under the Khmer Rouge, I talked about effacing conviction, which is where you have your beliefs and convictions, but you rub out the other person, you efface them, versus one that's effacing. Sorry, it's kind of an obscure word, but it is a word. Effacing is where you recognize the humanity of other people, even as you have your set of beliefs. But it's recognizing their humanity. So people say, well, how do you interview torturers, people who perpetrate mass killing? Well, as I said before, my view, and again, this is very uncomfortable, I'm guessing you three might agree with me, but the potential to do bad stuff lies within all of us. And it's first and foremost the recognition that we can be able to do that enables us not to do it, right? We're back to Auschwitz and critical self-reflection. And so that's sort of the beginning point. In class, I feel like any of my students are watching, they're all going to be dropping the class really soon after saying this, right? But, this is part of what the teaching's about, to sort of understand these mechanisms, as Adorno said, to de-reify. And that's the foundation of critical thinking. Uncomfortable, but absolutely necessary.
So how do I feel responsible as an MC. How do I send you home with some level of hope and not depressed? My experience is that somehow we, individually and collectively, need to find a way to break this pattern of us versus them. We need to find a way to break that pattern. So how can I break the pattern with someone who just is against me? I say, can we shake hands?
You did the old pull away the hand.
I do something crazy. Or I reach out. Can I shake your hand?
Fool me once.
No.
No.
Please, we gotta play the game.
My kids do this
you've
to me.
got a great looking hand. Look at those lines. Break the pattern. So however you choose to break the pattern, be confident in yourselves. Don't lose hope. We are more than that reification. I am more than a visible minority. I am dad, I am granddad, I am a shaved head, I'm a playful guy. All those categories begin to limit me because of one term, a visible minority. So thank you. Thank you for at least giving us a way of thinking about this. So I'm going to end by inviting Dr. Tara Shepard Longcoat, a brand new PhD, just graduated. And you know what they say about PhDs, right? We have a permanent head damage. So welcome to the world of head damage. And I'm telling you, Tara has won so many academic scholarships that I don't know where to start. And she's representing the Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Manitoba to offer Dr. Hinton a gift. Please.
Thank you. Can I get the gift? So on behalf of the PAXA Association, it's my pleasure to give thanks to you this evening. I really appreciated our dialogue earlier and sharing about our respective research. I really also appreciate, as a transgender queer person, that you're speaking truth to power and you're coming out and telling us about the importance of dealing with white supremacy and dealing with these movements and making sure that we bridge that gap between us and them. And as one of those targeted communities, please keep teaching your students, please keep doing these talks. I appreciated also your anthropological lens. And I'm going to look up Adorno tomorrow. Thank you. And I really, like you kept saying depressing, but I actually think you do offer hope. As PhD students, we're taught a lot about listening and dialogue and thinking about what's underneath those polarized positions. So I really appreciate what you said tonight, what you shared with all of us tonight. If we could give them one more round of applause.
And he's brought his books here. I'm sure he'll sign for you. No books.
Steal them off the internet.
Thank you. And you'll be here to just answer, if you'd like to visit with him. But please come back and visit us. And we are at Morrow Institute, just down the hall. Thank you, and good night.